Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar on Universal Design for Natural Areas. My name is Catherine Game, and I'm the Director of Communications and Public Engagement for Chicago Wilderness. Just a little background on Chicago Wilderness. We are a regional alliance that leads strategy to preserve, improve, and expand nature and quality of life in the broader Chicago region. We work in parts of Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and connect leaders across sectors to help build a resilient region. So we represent very diverse interests of about 200 members and partners who work together to advance a shared vision for conservation. And at Chicago Wilderness, we look at conservation through the lens of 6 very interconnected focus areas. Public engagement is particularly relevant to our conversation today. There are at least 1 in 10 people in the Chicago Wilderness region that have some kind of disability, and that's a large portion of our region's population. And we all believe that, all of our residents need access to our great outdoor assets. So we're really thrilled to offer this webinar today in partnership with ADA 25 Chicago, which is a network of over 200 civic partners across metropolitan Chicago who have come together to commemorate and advance this civil rights milestone, the 25th anniversary of the American Disabilities Act. We really believe that this effort is important for everybody in our region, and particularly in the conservation field. So today, for our webinar, just a few logistics before we get started. We're going to take all questions through the chat box feature, which on your screen you should see a little icon which has a conversation bubble. And if you click that, it will open up a box that has space for questions to be entered. So you can ask questions throughout the webinar. Jack and Mike will take them at the end, but we'll be collecting those as we go along. So I'm very pleased to welcome Jack Catlin, who's partner of LCM Architects, and Mike Passo, director of the Professional Trailbuilders Association, as our primary presenters today. And Jack is going to start us off with a discussion on accessible outdoor recreation.
Terrific. Thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction. A little bit about LCM Architects. We are located in the South Loop of Chicago, and we have about 45 people, of which about 30 focus on accessibility. We're unusual as an architectural firm. We do full-service architecture, but about 30 of us focus on Title II and Title III of the ADA, as well as the Fair Housing Act. I served on the U.S. Access Board under President Clinton and spent 7 years. When I was on the board, we got started with outdoor recreation and outdoor developed areas. When I got off the board, the U.S. Access Board wasn't completely done with that. So it took a couple of years after that before they were finished. But while I was on the board, we got started with developing the minimum standards that have been adopted, and I'll go through some of those and give you a little details on those standards. I also worked on the Illinois Accessibility Code back in the mid-1990s. That accessibility code is being revised as we speak. Hopefully within a year or so there will be an updated IAC, Illinois Accessibility Code, that will mirror the requirements, the federal requirements of the ADA. So what I want to talk about today, if we go to the next slide, what I want to talk about today are the accessibility standards, minimum accessibility standards that are in effect at the time. Talk a little bit about best practice or universal design for outdoor developed areas, and then go through very minimally go through the basic rules of ADA Title II and ADA Title III. Next slide. The Illinois Accessibility Code, as I said, became effective in 1997. A lot of people are not aware that the Illinois Accessibility Code covers recreation areas. I've listed those most of those recreation areas here. The bullet point at the bottom of this slide is technical provisions are not provided, which is difficult to understand what you're required to do under the Illinois Accessibility Code when the Illinois Accessibility Code doesn't tell you what to comply with. So, for example, campsites. There is no direction in terms of what an accessible campsite is under the Illinois Accessibility Code. We have solutions for that. We'll talk about those in a minute. Next slide, please. The ADA standards are a little bit different. They cover different areas. This is recreation areas. Some of these are recreation areas that are going to directly affect outdoor wilderness areas like recreational boating and fishing piers and golf facilities probably, play areas, swimming pools, that type of thing. What's good about the ADA is Chapter 10 of the ADA is technical provisions are provided. So, for example, if I was designing a recreational boating area, the ADA would tell me exactly what the minimum accessibility standards are. Not only do they have text of what those standards are, but they provide good diagrams to explain what is required. Next standard, please. Next slide, please. So, for example, the diagram you see here is transfer steps that take you can transfer from a wheelchair onto the steps on the right and then bump yourself down into the water. Or the photograph on the right is a pool lift. Now, if you've got a swimming pool, you're required to have at least one pool lift or an inclined slope to get into a swimming pool. It could be a ramp or a zero entry to get into the swimming pool. If the perimeter of that swimming pool is greater than 300 lineal feet, then you are required to have two means of getting in and out of that swimming pool. One is required to be a lift or a sloped entry. The other, you have options like the transfer steps. So the ADA does a good job of explaining exactly what is required for swimming pools. Next slide. Same is true for playgrounds. Generally, what's required in playgrounds is the play components themselves, a certain percentage of play components, a certain percentage of elevated play components if provided, and a certain percentage of the ground level play components are required to be accessible. And the guidelines describe what that means and how to achieve that. In addition, the route to the play area and the accessible play components is required to be accessible, and you're required to have an accessible surface under, impact attenuation surface underneath the accessible play components, so that if somebody falls off, they're falling off on a relatively soft surface, but a surface that's also accessible. Generally, wood chips are not accessible. There are some generic wood chip systems out there that are accessible, but only some, and it takes a lot of maintenance to keep them accessible. So bear that in mind. Next slide, please. We have boat docks and marinas. Again, lots and lots of diagrams. If you're planning to build a boat dock or a marina, the ADA will provide lots of information on how to meet those minimum standards. Next slide, please. Now, let's talk a little bit about best practices. What I'm referring to is the Outdoor Developed Area document that has been developed by the U.S. Access Board. And then what I see in this first bullet point here is U.S. Access Board-ABA, not ADA, ABA. The ABA is the Architectural Barriers Act. It was established in 1968, goes way, way back, the Architectural Barriers Act 1968, but it only applies to federally owned or leased facilities. So regarding outdoor developed areas, federal land management agencies, Forest Service, Department of Interior, national parks, that type of thing, are required to comply with the outdoor developed areas. State parks, local areas, if it's not federally owned or federally leased, there is no requirement to comply with the outdoor developed areas, but they provide an awful lot of good information. The Forest Service also provides good information. What's unfortunate about the ABA standards for the Access Board is they do not provide diagrams. It's only text, and the text describing what has to be done is done very well and goes into a great amount of detail, but they do not provide any diagrams. The U.S. Forest Service does provide diagrams that basically mirror what's in the U.S. Access ABA regulations. So I suggest and recommend that if one is designing outdoor areas, we'll go into what these outdoor areas are, one, look to the U.S. Access Board and the Forest Service for guidance on how to design them to be accessible. Now, the website there, the link there is to a manual that has been put together by the board. If you want to actually look at what the basic requirements of the outdoor developed areas are, it's access-board.gov, and go to the outdoor developed area section, and they will take you directly to the text of what the minimum standards are. The next slide, please. So the ABA has scoping requirements and technical provisions. Now, the scoping requirements apply to camping, picnic facilities, viewing areas, trails, and beach access routes. Scoping tells you how many elements are required to be compliant and where those elements are required to be. So, for example, if I'm designing a parking lot, the scoping requirement is going to tell me what percentage of those parking spaces in the parking lot are required to be compliant and where they're required to be, as close to the accessible route that leads to the accessible entrance. Then the second part of the ADA standards and the ABA standards are the technical provisions. The technical provisions will tell me how one designs an accessible parking space. So you got to look at both the scoping requirements and the technical provisions to know how many, where, and how to design the accessible element in question. The technical provisions, as I said, for the ABA Chapter 10 do not provide diagrams. That's unfortunate. The Outdoor Developed Areas manual that I have on the screen here does provide some diagrams, some, not a lot, but some. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about these areas. Trail. What is a trail? Well, under the ABA, it's a pedestrian route developed primarily for outdoor recreation purposes. It's about recreation. It's not about transportation or communication. As it says in the second statement there, a pedestrian route developed mainly to connect elements, spaces, or facilities within the site is not a trail. Why is that important? Those areas, accessible routes that link between a parking area and a campsite, let's say, have a higher level of accessibility and less exceptions, and we'll talk about exceptions later, but less exceptions than a trail does. A trail has a lower level of accessibility and more exceptions. Next slide, please. Newly constructed trails are required to comply. Alterations to existing trails, some existing trails are required to comply with the accessibility provisions of the ABA if it's federal land management. Now, these are recommendations if it's state or local. These are just recommendations. Next slide, please. Under the ABA, there's 8 different areas that are covered. The surface of the trail, how wide should a trail be? How often do you have to provide passing spaces on a trail so that 2 people in wheelchairs can get by each other? What obstacles, obstructions that occur on the surface? What are allowed? What isn't allowed? Openings within trails. If we have gratings within trails, you don't want large spaces between those gratings because crutch tips, wheelchair wheels can fall in between them. How steep can a trail be? How steep can the cross slope of a trail be? Resting intervals. These are flat areas within a sloped area so that a person can stop and rest. Protruding objects. These are things that stick into, above the surface of the trail, that protrude into the trail, so a person who's blind or visually impaired doesn't run into them. Signs, Mike will get into, got some good examples of signs. All these are the areas that, if you're looking at designing and constructing accessible trails, these are the different things one needs to look at. Next slide, please. Now, the U.S. Forest Service does provide diagrams, and here's some of those diagrams, and there's a link to that particular accessibility document. I talked about passing spaces, for example, and there's a couple of examples here. T-turns, where you've got two trails coming together, both is 36 inches wide, then those trails can remain at 36 inches wide. But if you've just got one 36-inch wide minimum trail, then I think it's every 200 feet or so, one is required to provide a space that allows somebody to get to the side so that two people in wheelchairs can pass each other. And that space, as well as the trail, has to comply with those minimum standards. Next slide, please. There are exceptions. The exception I've got pictured here is a portion of a trail. If you've got a portion of a trail that is very, very steep and it's impractical to make it accessible, let's say we're coming across the flatlands of northwestern Illinois, but all of a sudden there's a bluff and you have to get down that bluff. Well, if it's impractical to make that accessible, then you probably don't have to make that part of it accessible. But all the other parts of that trail need to be accessible where it's practical to make those parts accessible. And the second exception, next slide, is about the entire trail itself. If the entire trail it's impractical to make it accessible, then it may not be necessary to make that trail compliant with the Architectural Barriers Act. Next slide, please. Camping, the ABA addresses not only camping itself, but the parking, the accessible routes from the parking to the tent pads and the tent platforms and camp shelters and fire rings. All of those elements that serve that camp area are also covered. So if I've got a shower and bathroom, that's going to be covered by the Architectural Barriers Act as well. I'm just focused right here on some of the diagrams from the U.S. Forest Service on the actual tent area itself. Next slide, please. The picnic areas, the tables themselves, and again, those areas that serve that picnic table, whether it's trash receptacles, fire rings, stoves, that type of thing, the accessible route that takes you to the parking, the accessible route that would take you to bathroom facilities, toilet facilities, that type of thing. All of this would be covered under the ABA, and although you don't have to comply with the ABA if it's not federal, it's still a good idea, good universal design principles to apply to these areas. Next slide, please. Beach access, there's an awful lot about beach access here. Again, most of this is what we saw with trails, with the exception of the last one was dune crossings. How one deals with crossing sand surfaces, how often one is required to provide accessible routes onto a beach. So every half mile, one is required to provide an accessible route, unless, let's say you've got a beach that's 5 miles wide, there's only one route to that beach. Well, that one route would then be required to be compliant. But if you have 4 or 5 routes to that beach, the accessible requirement only extends to one at least every half mile. Next slide, please. Lots of different exceptions. All right, compliance is not practical due to terrain. One of my favorite photographs on the right here. It looks like there might be some terrain issues there. Compliance cannot be accomplished with the prevailing construction practices. And number 3 is a big one. Compliance would fundamentally alter the function or purpose of the facility or the setting. It is not the intention of the federal government to destroy the natural setting in order to make it accessible, right? So, for example, if one was using, you had to walk through a stream to get across the stream, and that was part of the experience, then it's very possible that you would not have to have an accessible route that went across that stream, right? Because you would be destroying one of the fundamental principles or functions of that setting. Next slide, please. If federal laws prohibit the accessibility because of the Endangered Species Act or the National Environmental Policies Act or the Historic Preservation Act, Wilderness Act, any other federal, state, or local law that's at odds with accessibility, those federal, state, or local laws will probably preempt the accessibility requirements. Right? Next slide, please. I want to talk about the two fundamental principles of the ADA. Now we're talking about the ADA. Title II of the ADA applies to any entity receiving any type of federal money. When I talked about the ABA, I said federally owned or leased. But here, if there's any kind of federal money that's involved in a not-for-profit or a local government, then Title II would be required. And what Title II requires is program accessibility. Program accessibility means that at least one, and a minimum one of each type of program, service, or activity that's being provided has to be provided in compliance with the Act, right, with the ADA. So it is not necessary, this is the number one here, it's not required public entity to make each of its existing facilities accessible and usable by individuals with disabilities. It's not necessarily about the facilities, it's about the programs, services, and activities that are being offered. So if I've got two campgrounds within a county, let's say, two campgrounds, I may only have to make one of those campgrounds accessible, but it's going to have to be completely accessible to fully meet the standards. The accessible parking, the route to the campground, the bathrooms that serve it, all of that is going to have to comply. But it may not be necessary that both campgrounds comply. All right, let's go to Title III, the next slide. Title III is different. Title III applies to public accommodations. No government money whatsoever, no state money whatsoever, totally private. There are still requirements. The ADA is a federal civil rights law. So even though it's not new construction or alteration, which have to comply under both Title II and Title III, if there's no new construction, no alteration occurring, there's still a requirement under the ADA. I talked about Title II. Under Title III, you have to remove barriers where such removal is readily achievable. The definition of readily achievable is easily accomplishable and able to be carried out without much difficulty or expense. And here the goal under barrier removal is that the entire, let's say we had a two campground scenario, both campgrounds would have to be brought up to compliance with the ADA standards if it was readily achievable to do. All right? So different approaches. If there's federal money involved, program accessibility, there's no federal money or state or any government money at all, there's still a requirement under ADA Title III to remove existing barriers. All right, next slide, please. And here's some resources that one can go to. The Access Board has some. U.S. Forest Service, as I mentioned. I also did not mention, but I would recommend, particularly about trails, the National Center on Accessibility. They have an awful lot of good information. They're down in Bloomington, Indiana. They are a private not-for-profit, but relied on a lot by the federal government in terms of the research that they do regarding outdoor developed areas. And that, I think, concludes my portion of this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jack. Just a reminder to everybody on the webinar, if you have any questions during the presentations, please use the chat feature to submit them, and we'll address them at the end of both presentations. So we're going to move right to Mike. And Mike Passo is the director of the Professional Trailbuilders Association. So Mike, we'll pass it to you.
All right. Can everybody hear me all right? I think I'm unmuted. Thanks so much, Jack, and thanks for putting on this webinar. As we said, my name is Mike Passo. I'm currently the director of the Professional Trailbuilders Association. I'm also on the board of American Trails. have been for, I think, 17 years or so now. And I also recently owned a sea kayak tour company, and that's where that photo on the cover came from. I just last year sold that and started full-time with the PTBA. So my goal here is to talk about trails in specific. And my primary goal is to show that sustainable trails and accessible trails are not mutually exclusive. They very much go hand in hand with each other. So with that, let's begin. Can we go to the next slide? So the basic concept of it's better to anticipate and prevent than to clean up after the fact is something we'll keep coming back to. And that's particularly true of trails. If you do not anticipate and prevent in building a trail, you're going to have a lot of cleanup after the fact, just from erosion and the use of the user groups of the trail. So let's move on to the next slide. So what is sustainable design just in general? I thought this was a good definition: making choices that simultaneously enhance or maintain the well-being of both people and ecosystems while not placing unbearable burdens, environmental, economic, or social, on future generations. I think that's very true, and that's particularly true of sustainable design with regards to trails. What I'd like to talk about here is kind of what the basics of sustainable design are with regards to trails, and how we apply that, and then we'll bring them together and we'll compare the ADA or the ABA trail guidelines with sustainable guidelines. And let's go to the next slide. And this is just another definition where sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present generation without precluding the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And next slide. So with regards to trails, it's first good to look at what the purpose of a trail is. And generally speaking, it's to provide access through an environment for people, to provide recreational opportunities and or transportation routes, and then to really focus that user impact on a prepared trail tread. Because it's one thing to provide access to a bit of land, but if you're not focusing the impacts, it can very quickly degrade the land. So that's what trails are all about. And next slide. And some of the things that cause trails to impact the environment are, well, first of all, the initial construction. You know, if you bring in a D4 dozer to build a trail, you're going to have a lot of damage to the environment before that trail even comes to the ground. And of course, users going off prepared tread, that kind of relates to the trails that just happened. Basically, if you put a trail in the wrong spot, people are going to go where they want to go. So it's really important to get it where people want to use it to avoid those users going off the trail. Anything you put on the ground is going to damage the natural drainage patterns of land. So anything we can do to minimize that damage to the natural drainage pattern is what we want to do to maintain the life of that trail without having huge amounts of maintenance coming in. And then the types of users we're dealing with have a huge impact on what the trail does to the environment, you know, whether it's wheels or hooves or feet, and whether the people are going uphill or downhill. It can all have a huge effect on what's happening. So you have to take that into account. And next slide. So just in terms of sustainable design, we kind of break it into three categories: environmental, social, and economic. And next slide. So some of the environmental aspects of sustainability are you know, in terms of when you're dealing with trails, you want to do it in a way that's going to enhance the ecosystem. You want to do it so that it can provide some education to the people that are using the trails. It can provide alternative forms of transportation. It can develop partnerships amongst the local groups and users. And it can conserve water and wastewater as well. Next slide. Some of the social aspects of sustainability are providing those opportunities, and that's what we're all probably, it looks like at least 90% of the people on the call are doing exactly this. They're providing those opportunities for recreation, relaxation, and becoming more healthy. Trails can help respect for cultural diversity. They can provide equal opportunities. You don't need money to go on a trail. Trails need to be built with money. I'll grant that, but once they're there, it's a pretty equal opportunity aspect. Social impacts on the community. I was just in Knoxville, Tennessee, and the professional trail builders are going to be having our conference in Knoxville, Tennessee in about 8 months. And we were looking at the trails and walked into a local convenience store, and the woman behind the counter said, "Oh, you wouldn't believe the difference that the trails that are in this area have made over the last 5 years. Just having them put in, we went from people demanding Lay's potato chips and Pepsi to needing power bars for their bike ride and water and oranges for the hike their family's going to take." So it was just a very obvious impact on that local community. And then, of course, heritage and education and really encouraging public participation is just huge with trails. Next slide, please. And then in terms of economic sustainability, you can develop green building practices by engendering that whole idea in the community. It can enhance the capital base. There's lots of research that's gone into showing how the land and the houses near trails go up in value, and the communities go up in value as you develop trails in and amongst them. You can demonstrate innovative techniques and equipment and promote economic development in the communities. And it's becoming more and more. We need more research to really make this case, but I think it's becoming more and more obvious that trails, almost more than golf courses and other recreation activities, really bring a lot of economic sustainability to an area. Next slide. And part of the sustainability, and the part that most directly relates to what we're talking about, is that plans need to design for all users. And that's, knowing the ability ranges of the people, how fast are they going? What kind of coordination do they have? Is it a bunch of preschool kids that use this area, or is it the mountain bike racers? Is it road bikers? Is it hikers? Is it families with strollers? That kind of information is all critical. And then doing your designs based on those abilities. If you throw in a dual slalom downhill mountain bike course on an area that's pretty much only used by families in the evenings for walks, it's not going to be a successful or a sustainable trail. So designing based on those intended user experiences is key. And next slide. And of course, in that process, don't forget about the rapidly expanding populations, which are older folks with the baby boomers, children and youth. The obesity epidemic is huge, so we're having children and adults that are less fit and less able to go further distances. Immigrants and tourists are huge, especially in some sections of the country. And then people with disabilities are also a rapidly expanding population, and that's largely what we're talking about today. Although, when we talk about sustainability, it takes all of this into account. there's a huge explosion in the veteran population with the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. They're coming back with some significant disabilities, and that is really creating some pressure for people with disabilities to get on the trails, because these are some active people. Next slide, please. So, as I said before, now I'd like to kind of compare and contrast some of the recreation trail standards that are out there. So Jack did a great job of going over the accessibility standards as they exist, and they're based on, as he said, the Architectural Barriers Act. And that right now, as he said as well, that's basically the best available information. They only apply federally, but they're the best available information for all trail construction. They're kind of the best current standards to go off of. And then some of the sustainable design standards that are out there are based on the IMBA developed design standards and the Forest Service Design Handbook. So some of the numbers I'm using will come out of both of those locations, and they're actually remarkably similar, and they tend to be the most used sustainable trail design standards that are out there. And next slide. So here what I've done is kind of created a little side by side, just to, I guess, show visually how similar both the ABA standards and the sustainability standards tend to be. So with surface, ABA standards call for firm, stable, and slip resistant. And I will note there that paved is not a requirement. Our members at the PTBA very rarely actually do accessible trails now that are paved. It's almost all requested that they're natural surface trails, but still meeting the accessibility guidelines. And the sustainable standards are essentially the same. Their standards are firm, stable, and resistant to use and erosion, which is, those are very compatible. The width for the ABA standards are 36 inches with exceptions to 32 inches. And the sustainability standards call for 36 inches where possible. So the width of two people passing on a trail. And of course they allow for, when needed, narrower treads, but so do the exceptions that Jack highlighted in the ABA standards. When we talk about openings, we're looking at, in the ABA standards, 1/2 inch openings with exceptions to 3/4 inch. So essentially a 1/2 inch sphere would not fall through a crack in the trail, or a 3/4 inch sphere. And then the sustainable standards are a little more general in those regards, and they suggest basically eliminating or minimizing obstacles on or above the trail tread surface. So, to the greatest extent possible, they're saying to eliminate obstacles that are 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, 2 inch, anything, that's on that tread that could be an obstacle. They're suggesting it be removed. Protruding objects are 4 inches laterally, so on the side into the trail tread zone, which is the trail width going up to 80 inches of vertical clearance. So think of it kind of as a doorway that's whatever width, say 36-inch trail, going up to 80 inches is your doorway, and you can only have protruding objects 4 inches into that. And then the sustainable standards kind of relate it to the users. So they say achieve user-specific space requirements on or above the surface. So essentially, if it's an equestrian trail, your doorway is wider and taller. I forget exactly. I think it's 120 inches high. But they're saying to remove all obstacles within that doorway. And the ABA standards apply essentially to a hiking user. So that's why it's an 80-inch height and then the width of the trail. So those are very, very similar as well. So next slide. In terms of grade, the ABA guidelines have a lot more detail. They tend to say you can go 5% for any distance, 8.33% for 200 feet, 10% for 30 feet, 12.5% for 10 feet, and then 14% for 5 feet in drainage dips if the cross slope is less than 5%. And then the sustainable standards don't go into the detail, but their standards say to keep the grade less than 10% in order to minimize erosion and water for water and for users. And there can be exceptions for short distances. So where required to go above 10%, that's allowed. And if you look at the ABA standards, that's essentially real similar. It doesn't go into the 5% for any distance or anything like that. But if you consistently keep your grade below 10% and like a well-designed sustainable trail has grade reversals, which means you go for a period of time down and then they ask you to go up. And that's an opportunity in that grade reversal from down to up, there's an opportunity to shed your water off of the trail. Well, that combination of having grade reversals throughout your trail is going to give you the spectrum of grades that you're looking at on the ABA trail, and it turns out to be almost identical. If you look at somebody that strictly followed the IMBA guidelines and somebody that strictly followed the ABA guidelines, the trails are going to look remarkably similar in terms of grade. And then cross slope at the bottom. This is an area where it's really the one dramatic departure that I've found in the two standards. So for the ABA standards for accessibility, they would like a 5% maximum cross slope on natural surface trails, and then 10% in drainage dips if the width is more than 42 inches. And then for sustainable standards, they essentially call for the minimum cross slope that's required for drainage to be effective. And in most cases on natural surface, and I highlighted this in red because it is a little bit different, it tends to be 5 to 8% cross slope to get water off of a natural surface trail. And then of course 2% for paved surfaces. So that's really, when you say a 5% maximum for accessibility, that's the largest departure, and perhaps actually the toughest thing to deal with is that cross slope. But like we say, the ABA does allow for those drainage dips to have greater cross slope because that's critical to maintaining the sustainability of your trail, and that starts to get at those higher numbers in the natural surface trails on the sustainable side. I think the key there is they're asking you to make a wider trail when the cross slopes get a little steeper, and that the sustainable standards do not ask for that difference. I saw the little note on what is IMBA. It's International Mountain Bike Association. And the next slide. And then I can go through these relatively quickly, but the rest areas, they call for every 30 feet on grades over 10%, and they should be at least 60 inches long, or whatever the trail width, and have a cross slope of 5%. And the sustainability standards do not call for rest areas. However, the standard best practice for sustainable trail, like I said, is having grade reversals consistently throughout the trail. And those grade reversals essentially act as creations of rest areas. So if you imagine a little bit of a rolling trail that kind of goes up and then down and up and down, every time it goes down, it has an opportunity to shed water, which is your drainage control. But at each of the down areas and each of the up areas, at the tops and the bottoms, you're going to have flat areas, and those are essentially rest areas. So that works in really very nicely. It's a very consistent. In fact, a well-designed sustainable trail probably has them more than every 30 feet. And protruding objects, actually, I doubled that one up. It looks like we talked about that one already. Tread obstacles. ABA standards are for 2 inches off the tread with exceptions to 3. And again, the sustainability standards, they eliminate and minimize those obstacles, really no matter what size they are, off of the trail tread surface. And passing spaces are a requirement under the ABA every 1,000 feet, where they're at least 60 inches wide. And there's no requirement in sustainability standards. So that's a bit of a discrepancy there, but again, a well-designed trail, even if it is designed at a 36 inches, in the areas where it's appropriate, they're going to want to spread it out so that people can go ahead and pass each other. Next slide, please. So again, it's better to anticipate and prevent than clean up after the fact, and I hope that those tables kind of give you a concept that the accessible trails are not mutually exclusive from sustainable trails. They're actually one and the same, and if you follow either one of the standards, you're going to get very close to the standards of the other. There may be some slight tweaks here and there that you have to make to meet both standards, but it doesn't actually take much. And that, I guess that's the point we like to get across, is that the ABA standards can come across on the knee jerk as scary and hard to come at, but if you build a good trail, it's almost surely going to work in to the ABA standards, especially with the exceptions that are out there. So those exceptions for drastic terrain and things like that, that's what's going to allow you, and that's what allows you the flexibility to still make a trail that's for the most part accessible, except for that one point where those two walls come too close together. And then if that's the case, then you just need to tell people about those places and document why you weren't able to meet the standards in that spot. So next slide. And that gets down to the idea of assessing trail conditions. For years, I've taught the universal trail assessment process. It's a way of taking a trail that exists and objectively measuring all the aspects of it, and then providing that information to management and users. And I really do believe it can be very hard to do, to find enough people to go out and assess a trail, but there's a lot of ways that the maintenance crew in the course of their duties can just take a couple of little measurements that can really go a long way toward letting people know what's out there. So next slide. And let's go to the next slide. So I talked about the universal trail assessment process, but we look at essentially 5 or 6 key things: the length, the width, the cross slope, the grade, the surface, and then any features and facilities that you find. But those first 5 are the key ones that allow people to decide for themselves whether a trail is the experience they want. And as you all know, you can have 2 people that use a wheelchair, and one person can go on 30% grades and the other can't go on anything more than 12% grades. So there's a broad spectrum. Even amongst folks with disabilities, you can't make one trail that's accessible to everybody. It's just not possible. And what's accessible to one is not accessible to another. So providing some of this key information is critical, so that they can choose for themselves. Next slide. And then using some of those indicators of environmental sustainability, what percent of the trails in forest cover or has vegetation cover, and is there a change in non-native species after the trail is in there, or the number of desired species? So you can use some of these indicators to determine whether the trail you put in is actually sustainable. And a truly sustainable trail will not increase the number of non-native species because they're changing the water flow. It'll maintain or even improve the desired species. And next. And then socially, how many people are using the trail this year versus last year? Is the park accessible to people of all ages and abilities? Are people of all ages and abilities using the trail consistently? Is it still providing opportunities at little or no cost? And is the quality response high quality as well? Next slide. And then in terms of indicators of economic sustainability, are the local businesses getting involved? Are like that little convenience store? Are they selling higher quality treats and snacks? Are they selling fruit instead of candy bars? And is this area becoming well known? Is it getting a word for itself? Are people going to the website? Are funds being raised? Is it increasing the value of the homes in the area? You can determine your success based on some of these economic indicators and social and environmental. Next slide. And then socially, are the visitors? Oh wait, didn't we do this? Yeah, there we go. Thanks. So I guess my point is, and I'll just come back to it one last time and not try and beat you over the head with it, but essentially, use the design criteria, use the indicators, use the concepts of sustainable design, and you're going to have a sustainable and an accessible trail. And next. And of course, the key is always to avoid these design tragedies. Like you don't want to throw a trail in the name of accessibility that's going to completely destroy the environment or the environmental character even. Putting this huge handrail and monster set of switchbacks in this area was pretty much a design tragedy, and you can tell because everybody walks around it and they take this route down the side instead of doing the course. So that's a good indicator of whether your design tragedy happened or not. So try and get it in, work it into the environment as it is, and meet some of those design criteria. Next. And I can't emphasize this enough, expect the unexpected. You may think, oh, well, nobody with disabilities is going to come skydiving with me, but there are more and more people out there. The people are becoming more active. There's a big push to get activity to combat the obesity epidemic, and as that starts to take hold, you're going to see more and more people in various ability levels out there. And the skydiver on top is a man that has CP and is completely unresponsive essentially, but he had an amazing experience. And on the bottom left is a blind Paralympic what's that called, biathlon, and he uses a little beeping system to target his rifles. And then on the right, of course, there's all kinds of new contraptions for getting people out into the woods that weren't there before. There's off-road mountain bikes for that are hand cycle driven, and there's more and more. If you look on the accessibility side of things for vets especially, they're really doing some pretty amazing chairs and equipment for getting people out there. Next slide. And if you can't do it, obviously in this picture, you're not going to make that accessible. Without massive amounts of dynamite, which of course would destroy the nature of the area. So if you can't do it, next slide, I would encourage you to tell people about it. So these are two sets of signs that kind of do a good job. One is off of the web, and one is like a little fence post sign that you could put right next to your trail. It gives you the very, very basics to let a person decide for themselves whether it's accessible or not. Again, you're talking who's to use it, what's its length, what's the grade, cross slope, width, and surface type. And then at the bottom of the sign on the right, you can see there's tells you there's up to 3-inch rocks and 3-inch roots. Excuse me. So providing that in any way you can, and these signs, granted, come from a full assessment of the trail, but again, you could just have your maintenance guy go out there and tell them, or maybe show them, these are the types of areas that can cause barriers to people of differing abilities. So when you're going around, if you see an area that's full of roots, or you see a particularly steep area, just to stop for a second, measure it, and write down that it's a 13% grade for approximately 50 feet. And if you can come back, excuse me, and tell people about it, that goes a long way towards accessibility. It doesn't have to be a full all the way on. That's one thing in my time with UTAP is I really started at the end, the Universal Trail Assessment process, by the way. I really at the end started to encourage people to take the concepts and not necessarily, if you can't afford to have a crew go out and take the full-on assessment, just take the portions that you're able to do and do your best to get the information out there. Next slide. So I guess the upshot is ensure your park or trail provides the best experience possible. And the upper right-hand picture is out of California, and it completely meets 100% the accessibility requirements. It's a natural surface trail through the redwoods of California, and it looks like a trail that's been there for 40 years, and yet it completely meets the accessibility guidelines. Next slide. And just think through it. Make sure everybody's involved if possible. And I think that's it for the next slide. So I think thanks a lot for listening, and I'm going to turn it over to the crew here for questions.
Thanks, Mike. Again, a reminder to everybody to just type in any questions you have in the chat box, and we'll take them. Looks like we have a couple. And thanks again to Jack and Mike for such great presentations. Very informative. It looks like, Jack, from your presentation, we had a question from Mark. For Title II entities, in your example of a campground for program access, would the one accessible campground be required to meet the scoping requirements for the ADA?
Well, for those areas that would be covered by the ADA, remember, the campgrounds are not covered by Chapter 10 of the ADA. Outdoor recreation or outdoor developed areas are covered, but are not required unless it's a federal land management situation. So, is that answering the question, or is there more detail to the question?
I think that answers it. Mark, go ahead and send us a follow-up if not. Let's see. The other question we had is, what types of natural surfaces work best for trails?
Mike, if you want to grab that one.
Yeah, sure. The ones I find that work really well, and there are a lot, first of all, and the contact that Jack gave you for the National Center on Accessibility did a great study on surfaces and how they perform over time. But crushed limestone has been really great for many of our members. But each area has their own version, and what you need to find is a crushed rock that has, usually it's 1/4 minus, and the minus means there's fines in the mix. So you need a mix of crushed rock that has a thorough, consistent mix of sizes from dust all the way up to whatever the quarter quarter minus or whatever size gravel you use or crushed stone. And limestone works great. And I'll tell you, I was doing an assessment in, I think it was Duluth, Minnesota, and they use street sweeping. So what gets swept up from the street was just being thrown away, and they were looking at it, and I think they left it out in the rain for a while, and they noticed how hard the pile got. And so they started using that as their surfacing for the material, and it was as good a surface as I've ever seen, to be honest. So there's a lot of possibilities out there, and it might take some creativity to find what locally is available and what works well. But like I say, the NCA did a great study on it.
From my perspective, you want a surface that compacts. You want water to drain through it. That's desirable. But you want a compact surface. You don't want a lot of loose gravel, if you will, to use a generic term. You don't want a loose surface. You want a compact surface. The harder the surface, the better. One thing about limestone is it's a critical component of concrete, and it tends to harden and compact over time. And I agree with Mike. It can become a very good surface.
Mm-hmm. Great. We have clarification from Mark on his question as well. He says, for a local Title II agency, are we required to meet the number of campsites in the federal scoping requirements when we only need to meet the program access and Illinois accessibility code requirements?
Under the strict requirements, you would be, the Illinois accessibility code is what would be required. But the Illinois accessibility code doesn't go into an awful lot of detail. So where there is detail that you need to apply to a campground, because the IAC doesn't provide it, I would look to the outdoor developed areas or the U.S. Forest Service to supplement that information. But yes, the IAC is a requirement.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And then we have a question from Bonnie. She says, I love Peter's work at Beneficial Design. From a typical user standpoint, the TAI isn't user-friendly. Most people have no clue what grade and slope percentages mean. I highly encourage people to use different language and photos to describe the access features of a trail. And then she also asks if the slideshow will be available online. So that's more of a comment. Or Jack, if you have any additional comments on that.
Well, the only thing I can suggest is for additional information is to again look to the outdoor developed areas under the ADA and look to the U.S. Forest Service. They can get into an awful lot of detail that can help you understand. We only had an hour to go through this today. I've done this presentation before in great detail, and it took 3.5 hours. So. And when we have the time, we can go into that detail.
Can I just make a quick comment to Bonnie's comment? I agree that it is. Most people do not know right off the bat what a 14% grade is or what a 10% cross slope is. And the idea of the TAI strip, and it's definitely arguable whether it's a success or not, but the idea is that a person would go on a trail that had a TAI strip and they'd see that it said its maximum was 22% and its cross slope was 10%, and they would experience it, and then that would provide a baseline for them in the future to go to another trail that has some information similar to that. And then the next trail they went on said it had an 18% grade. Well, they would know, well, I got through that 22% that I did last week, so 18% should be fine. So they start to build a baseline of information that they can then compare. So that's the theory behind it. And but I 100% agree that right off the bat, people do not know what those numbers mean.
And to her question about the slideshow being available, we are recording the webinar, so this recording will be available online on the Chicago Wilderness website. And it looks like that's all of the questions for now. So thanks to everyone for joining us. Thank you also to ADA 25 Chicago for partnering with us on this, and to Natalie Paveda for helping to organize. Just a quick plug for another upcoming Chicago Wilderness event. Our Natural Resource Management Committee is hosting a restoration roundtable that's highlighting 2 platinum-level Excellence in Ecological Restoration sites. So save the date for this, October 6th at 9 a.m., and we have more information on our website. And if you are a Chicago Wilderness member, we encourage you to hop on to our member portal and email us to get set up on that. So thanks to everyone for joining. Thank you, Jack, and thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
All right.